All right, guys, so continuing on with our inverted guard series, let's talk about inverted guard flexibility, right? So our number one hang up for being comfortable while being inverted is gonna be our hip and our hamstring flexibility. If I can't touch my toes, or if I can't comfortably rest at least one of my legs against my chest, I'll always struggle feeling comfortable with the inversion. It's less about having a strong and flexible neck and more about having a strong and flexible lower body. It's kind of counterintuitive, right? We think that the pressure is going to be on our back. The issue is we get so comfortable having locked up hamstrings and having really tight hips that our back becomes the weakest link in the chain. So we tend to overcompensate for a lack of flexibility in our legs by having a hyperflexibility in our back, only because it has a lot of vertebrae that are able to separate, and that's where our real kind of uncomfortable or our injuries happen. So a couple stretches I do every single day to make sure I'm staying limber and staying loose for my inverted guard look a little bit like this. So our first and easiest kind of stretch we're gonna work on is gonna target our hamstrings, but it will work on our hip flexors also, loosening up the back side of our hips through our butt and also on the interior. So all I do is I sit with my legs together. We call it a pike stretch. A pike stretch, we have our legs together, our legs are straight, I'm driving my knees flat into the mat. So now for some of us, just sitting in this position is gonna be very difficult, right? So if our knees are off the mat, I'm gonna lean back a little bit until I get my legs down all the way flat. If I feel comfortable with a 90-degree angle with my spine to the mat, then I work on moving my hips forward. And the goal here is to be able to relax our hips enough to rock them forward. A lot of us will sit in this pike position and we're gonna have a hunched back only because our hips won't allow us to rock forward. So if that's the case, our emphasis is less on our hamstrings and more on our hips. So let's make sure we identify where our weakest link is gonna be. For me, I have a pretty loose hamstring. I can sit down. My hips tend to be a little bit tighter than my hamstrings. And so when I do this stretch, I feel it more in my hips than I do in my legs. So I'm sitting and I'll just rock back and forth to loosen up, right? The second thing I do is I walk my toes forward and backwards. And all I'm doing is trying to get a really long extension throughout each leg. So I drive my left leg forward, left leg comes back, left leg comes forward, and then we just swim them back and forth, all right? So I'm not just wiggling my toes, I'm actually trying to move my hips and turn. So everything gets turned, and I can feel that through my hamstrings, I feel it in my calves and my Achilles, and I feel the pull on the top side of my shin here as I drive my heels back to my toes, all right? So we call this pointing our toes and flexing our toes, all right? So when we flex, we pull our toes back towards our hips. When we point, we push them away, and we try and stretch this as long as possible. I'm looking to get my toes as close to the mat as I possibly can. And when I flex, I'm looking to raise my heels off the mat if I can, right? So I've accomplished the goal of getting my heels off the mat, driving my hamstrings down, and keeping my hips at a 90-degree angle to my thighs. Now I start closing that angle. So when I do my pike stretch, I'm gonna relax my feet this time. That way I'm not putting too much stress on my hamstrings. And I'm gonna work on driving my belly button towards my knees, not my nose to my knees, okay? So when we first start doing this stretch, we tend to round our back because we get that instant gratification of being able to get our nose down pretty close to our knees, right? I wanna avoid that. I wanna really think about having a long spine, bringing my belly button towards my knees, and bringing my head and my nose as close to my toes as possible. So I'm gonna reach forward, elongate my spine, and now drive through. So I'm way far away from my shins with my face, but that's okay, right? If I cheat this, I can go all the way down, but I'm taking all the pressure off of my hips and my hamstrings, and I'm rounding my back to get that goal. So this is exactly what happens when we invert, right? The weakest link of the chain is gonna be our spine. So I push my back to the mat or to the ceiling, and I round my back, getting my face down, and that's gonna alleviate the pressure from my hamstrings and my hips and put it into my back, and that's not what I want, right? Our hamstrings and our hips are able to flex, are able to stretch a lot more than we think. So it's important I get these muscles nice and long and keep everything nice and loose. Once I feel comfortable with that, I'm gonna keep working, walking my way down, nice and loose. I'm not a big fan of static holds. I like dynamic movements, and so I'm gonna be walking all the way down, keeping myself loose, reaching for my toes, trying to get the sole of my feet in my hand, and just wiggle back and forth. As I wiggle, I feel it move, and I'm getting a larger range of motion in my stretch, and I'm stretching a larger range of muscles. So, as opposed to a static stretch, where I'm just reaching forward and holding one position, I'm gonna reach and kind of walk my way down. I'm gonna wiggle back and forth, loosening my hips, elongating my spine, and trying to make myself as pancaked as possible. If I feel comfortable reaching out and grabbing my heels, then I work on flexing my toes back and walking the palms of my hands to the soles of my feet. As I flex my toes, I'm gonna feel a completely different stretch in the back of my legs. So I wanna make sure I'm keeping myself safe. I'll walk one arm at a time. I'm gonna grab my toes. I'm gonna try and put my wrist on my big toe and then fold my hand down so my fingertips are getting closer to my heel. So nice and stretched. I pull my leg off the mat, feeling that hamstring pull. And then I'm gonna switch to the other side. So assist with my outside hand. Same side hand reaches over. I'm gonna reach as far as I can. Pull that heel off the mat. Right? We're really trying to get a good extension here. Nice and loose in our hamstrings and getting that knee pulled off the mat. I never want to go too far. I want to take it as far as I feel comfortable. If I'm feeling any pain at all, I reduce the pressure. If I can't get to my toes without bending my knees, I need to take a step back. All right? I'm going to focus on just being able to sit here comfortably, being able to flex our feet without having to reach forward. Right? You'll feel a completely different stretch once I add the flex and the reach in. And the goal here is to find all those points that feel like you're getting something productive out of them. It's important to know our own bodies and not push too far. So I have one leg down, I can elevate it, I can get that hyperextension. Other side, nice big pull, nice big hyperextension. Now I'm working on getting both legs together. So I walk my hands down, I reach as far as I possibly can. So I'm making sure I'm reaching, I'm pulling. Seeing if I can get that heel off the ground. Again, lots of mobility, lots of movement, playing with a large range of motion here. I point, the flex feels completely different. I flex. I feel a different position, a different stretch. Nice and loose. Shake those legs out a little bit. We're not gonna stay in any one position too long. From there, I look at making this a little bit more challenging. Once we feel comfortable doing a pike, I'm gonna make my pike into a jiu-jitsu technique, kind of. So we're gonna do a piked Granby roll. And the effort here is to keep our feet as close to the ground as possible. And then make sure we're still utilizing that same stretch technique of pulling through the back of our hamstrings and our hips and trying to avoid crunching and rounding our back. So if I'm able to flatten myself out in this pike stretch, I should be able to turn that pike stretch into our Granby roll. So I pike stretch, I reach behind me, I'm looking to come underneath, and sit all the way up. So we just did a Granby roll via a pike stretch, which is kind of mixing our gymnastic stretching in with our jiu-jitsu techniques. But the reality is, as I do a piked Granby, to me this feels a lot more jiu-jitsu than anything else, because when I do a Granby roll, in our line drills, when we kind of just roll over, there's no basis in reality for that movement unless we're wrestling and we're defending a takedown. When it comes to using a Granby to become this inverted guard technique, it's really important that I keep it based in reality. So the first thing we do for our line drills is to do that. We keep it based in reality. I'm gonna start from a butterfly guard, I still put one hand behind my back. We tend to call this our sassy hips, right? Our sassy hands. And so I'm gonna put my hands on my hips, and I'm gonna frame my tricep on the ground to help keep my butt off the ground. So our first step is gonna be, we flop, we push, and we put that frame in there. I have a frame keeping me. So if I have somebody who's leaning on my shin, I can still frame on them. Their weight goes down through skeletal structure of my forearm. Now as I go to change positions, my top side hand becomes my frame on the top side leg. Here we go. Our head's nice and loose. There's no pressure on my neck or my back, and I finish my Granby roll. Come underneath. And I should be able to tick-tock here back and forth. To make this a little more difficult, we add our pike stretch into the exact same technique, right? So I'm gonna do my sassy hip Granby roll, right? I'm gonna add a pike stretch into it. My legs stay out in front of me. We roll back and forth. So frames on the back of our triceps to help us keep structure. Our core has to be engaged to elevate our butt off the ground. Our feet now are gonna drag. We switch sides, and we sit up. So hips engaged. All the way up. My hips, my elbow comes in, my tricep frame's in the mat, my palm is on my hip. I push up, I transition through. If I have to hover my feet, I can hover my feet a little bit, that's okay. But the effort is to try to compress ourselves as much as we can. Now, when I put my hands in for frames on my hips, that's gonna keep me from putting the pressure on my lower back. Okay, so it's really important I use those until I feel more comfortable. So again, I come in, I pop up, put my frame in. Here I drag my feet across. My feet can elevate if I have to. But the goal here really is to keep our feet flat on the mat and just kind of drag our toes. And then we just let it fall to the mat. Picking it up. The next step is to get rid of our frames here. Work through our forward fold pike stretch and see if we can Granby by bringing our chest down to our knees, all right? So I want our back flat on the mat this time. So on the first one, we elevated our hips from the side. You can see my hips elevate way off the mat. I transition over, whether it be a hover or a slide. This one, our back goes straight to the mat. The same rules apply though. If I have to hover my legs, I hover my legs. If I can keep my toes on the mat, then I keep my toes on the mat. But I want to emphasize keeping my lower back and my butt as close to the mat as possible. So I hit my forward fold. I'm driving myself underneath. I like to cross grab my feet and shrug my shoulder on the inside. We're coming underneath. The first one I'm going to hover. All right, let me go back and forth. The cross grab, go behind. And we're really trying to keep our hips as close to the mat as possible. As we progress, we're trying to keep our toes down. Thinking about somebody laying on our hamstrings and kind of smash us there. As I come through, I get smashed here. The person's smushing me. I can pull myself into myself. Working my way through my inversions. We get to a point with our inverted guard where our legs comfortably lay against our chest and there's no more smushing, right? The person is laying and our legs, they're laying on our hamstrings. The face of our legs is on our chest and our back are on the mat, or our back's on the mat. And there is no more smushing that can happen. Forward fold. Coming underneath. We're stretching down. Working our way back up. All right, so we're folded. They're laying on top of our hamstrings. Our chest is on the ground. Our chest is on our knees. Our back's on the mat, and they're smushing. The reality is, I can have my legs bent here. All right, if somebody is really on top of me, my legs are going to be bent, and they're smashing me through this range, which is much more comfortable than a straight leg. For the sake of the drill, the goal today is flexibility, and so we're going to work on keeping our legs straight, pulling ourselves nice and tight, and then working on that Granby roll through a piked position. The whole goal today is loosening up those hips and hamstrings, making sure we're not letting our flexibility or our lack of flexibility keep us from doing the techniques that we want to do. Inverted guard is a very diverse system, and it allows us to do some really unique things. The biggest thing I see as an advantage to inverted guard is traditional guard is played with legs primarily used as frames and arms primarily used as manipulators, okay? So if I have feet on the hips, I might grab an upper arm and go arm drag. Legs are keeping the person away from me. They're our pushers. Arms are gonna be our pullers, okay? What that does is it makes us more inclined to push through into a guard pass. So a lot of guard passes happen because of an overactive guard play. When we invert guard, we switch everything. Our arms become our frames. I'm in framing on somebody. My arms are my pushers, and my legs are pummeling inside to be my manipulators or my attackers. That allows me to have a much more diverse attack game, and the attacks come from a position that is not immediately recognizable to my opponent, which usually lets me be on the advantage. Sneaky things are where I want to be. Even if they're not sneaky, they're still coming from different angles that might be a little bit harder for our opponent to interpret. So let's summarize the whole thing. We're going to work on first just being able to sit in a pike, sitting comfortably, thinking about having ourselves at a 90-degree or more acute angle without rounding our back. Nice and tall, using our hips to flex forward, not rounding our back and thinking we're being successful. If I can do that, I work on having a flexed foot the same position. I flex my feet back. Hamstrings are flat on the mat. Toes are flexed. Now I work on getting my heels off the mat, right? It's a small motion, but now I can see there's a gap under my heels to the mat. If I feel comfortable there, I look at getting myself elongated and starting that forward fold. So elbows come down if I can, chest comes up, and I'm just seated in this forward fold. From here I can work on walking my toes, flexing and pointing opposite, elongating the leg that's pointed, contracting the leg that's flexed. And we switch positions, right? Back and forth. If I feel comfortable there, I progress to pulling my toes and getting my heels off the mat. Our progression from there is gonna be reaching all the way forward, palms to the sole, lifting our leg and getting a hyperextension through our hamstrings and our knees, switching sides, forward fold, pull it off the mat, really trying to expose that gap under our heels. From there, we talked about using our Granby rolls. So we did our sassy hips, kind of high Granbys. Frames come in, leg straight, bent leg. We switch, top arm becomes a frame. We switch, adding our tic-tacs in, going back and forth. And then we talked about using a forward fold with our Granby roll. So I cross grab, hand behind the back, chest goes down. I can either hover my feet over or I can keep my toes on the mat. Whatever I feel comfortable doing. Never go beyond your comfort zone. Progressively getting ourselves more and more smashed, more and more pancaked out. Guys, the flexibility is going to be the controller of this whole position, right? The biggest thing we talk about in gymnastics is strength throughout a large range of motion. So we can be flexible and weak, we can be very strong and rigid, or we can be a combination of the two. I promise you, you'll feel stronger and you'll feel healthier if you find that middle ground of being fit, muscular, but also being flexible enough to utilize those muscles and strong enough to keep your joints safe throughout that extended range of motion. Guys, this is not easy. These are things that happen over a long period of time. Flexibility training is extremely frustrating because your gains become minimal. We're talking about fractions of an inch every time we stretch at best. So stick with this. It's gonna feel very uncomfortable. Make sure you're honest with the positions, right? Let's not cheat these. Let's keep them really strict in our movements and see how our growth goes from there. This is gonna be one part of a long series on inverted guard. So check back, make sure you guys subscribe and learn along with me. Let's get more flexible, let's get stronger, let's improve our guard game and our overall jiu-jitsu. Next time, guys.